Yesterday, the Supreme Court heard arguments over a redistricting case coming out of the state of Louisiana that could, in fact, put part of the Voting Rights Act into jeopardy. It might be, well, unneeded at this point, not necessary for us to continue to gerrymander districts on racial lines to remedy issues that go back to Jim Crow days, right? Maybe we've now transcended that. That's what the arguments were all about yesterday. And lots was revealed. I'm going to lay it all out for you and explain why this is such a game changer. But there was one other thing that was revealed yesterday during these arguments. I think we have confirmation now. It's not just hypothesis. It's not just, us sort of trying to read between the lines and seeing if it's true. No, we have confirmation. Ketanji Brown Jackson could very well be the stupidest woman in Washington, D.C. We're going to show you that in a quick second. But first, the crux of the case was really laid out here by the advocate for keeping these gerrymandered districts. These are districts all through the South that have been drawn specifically to make them majority Black districts. They're across the board represented by Democrats right now, Black Democrats elected in these Black districts. And the lawyer for the NAACP explains exactly why these districts have to stay just as they are. Listen carefully what she says.
That's right. And in the state of Louisiana, that analysis was conducted in the Nairn case. And it was clear that regardless of party, white Democrats were not voting for Black candidates, whether they were Democrats or not. And we know that there is such a significant chasm between how Black and white voters vote in Louisiana that there's no question that even if there is some correlation between race and party, that race is the driving factor.
All right. So did you catch it? You have to keep these Black districts in the South right now, gerrymandered and drawn specifically to make them majority Black because white Democrats are racist. That's right. We have to keep Black majority districts in the South right now because white Democrats refuse to vote for a Black Democrat. One more time.
Right, and in the state of Louisiana, that analysis was conducted in the Nairn case, and it was clear that regardless of party, white Democrats were not voting for Black candidates.
Now, that's not me saying it. That's the lawyer for the NAACP. And here's what's remarkable to me. We have a good handful of Black Republicans in the House of Representatives, right? And they're terrific. I mean, great conservatives who are Black, who got elected in their districts. And interesting thing about the districts that these Black Republicans got elected in, they're majority white districts. White Republicans happily voted for a Black candidate if that Black candidate reflected their values, their principles, and their priorities. But you just heard from the NAACP lawyers that white Democrats will not vote for Black Democrats, regardless of political affiliation. Make that make sense to me. Within the confines of what these advocates are saying, that we have to keep these districts. It seems to me that if we have white Republican districts in the South that are electing Black representatives, that proves prima facie that we no longer need these racially gerrymandered districts. There's plenty of ways for there to be Black representation in the House of Representatives. We've proven it. But the arguments continued. Now, listen to this exchange with Sonia Sotomayor, because she may be in second place to Ketanji Brown Jackson in the IQ test.
You could control for partisan effect. There was racially polarized voting even within the Democratic Party. That's where Section 2 matters, where you have a reason to think that a racial group is being treated.
Here too, you have proof of that here.
No, you don't. What you have here is that Republicans and Democrats are different. There's
no. You have some that even white Republicans or white Democrats won't vote for black candidates.
Right, but if these were white Democrats, there's no reason to think they would have a second district. None. And so what is happening here is their argument is because these Democrats happen to be black, they get a second district. If they were all white, we all agree they wouldn't get a second district. That is literally the definition of race subordinating traditional principles.
Boy, oh boy, she walked into that one, didn't she? And that is the bottom line. The only distinguishing factor in these congressional districts is the color of the skin of the populace within the district. And that flies in the face of a whole other set of statutes. So you've got some laws that say you can't draw these lines based on race, but then you've got these other statutes that say you have to draw these lines on race, or even worse, you've got a judge compelling the state to draw these lines based on race. All of these conflicting rights and all of these conflicting decisions from different judges. That's why it ends up before the Supreme Court. That's why these 9 justices now have to determine it. But Sotomayor, trying to make a point here about how racist whites are that they won't vote for blacks, actually opened up the argument by the Deputy Solicitor General here, who did a magnificent job, when he basically said, yeah, here's the thing. If all of the people involved here were white in these states, this wouldn't even be a discussion. They would be able to politically draw these lines because Republicans have been in charge of the state legislatures and in the governor's house in these states for decades now. And just as we've seen in states like Massachusetts or Maryland or Illinois or Connecticut or what have you, the party that's in charge and dominates, they start drawing the lines to make sure that they get the most political power. And the only reason these districts exist and get handed to Democrats is because the color of the skin of the people who live there. And that is unconstitutional. And that's the crux of the argument. Enter Ketanji Brown Jackson, Biden appointee, former Broadway musical star, legend, dare I say. She engaged in these arguments now. And I got to say, 2 things that I want you to listen for. First, how often she says in her arguments, I don't understand. I believe in last session, we had a montage that we played for you of the literally hundreds of times she said from the bench, I don't understand. Maybe it's just a rhetorical trick. Maybe she does understand, but she just says that to sort of elicit an answer. But it's not a good look for a Supreme Court justice. But also, I want you to listen to this questioning and the tone that Ketanji Brown Jackson takes up here, because she does not sound like a Supreme Court justice challenging an advocate to make a case on a legal basis in oral arguments. She sounds like a panelist on Abby Phillips' show on CNN. She sounds like a partisan political commentator. Listen to this. But then, most importantly, listen to her really reasonable, sound legal argument.
I don't understand why your answer to Justice Kagan's question about, is this a compelling state interest, is no. The answer is obviously yes, that you have an interest in remedying the effects of racial discrimination that we identify using this tool. Whether you go too far in your remedy is another issue, right?
Your Honor, I think step 0 in all of these cases, it was certainly step 0 in the Robinson litigation, is the plaintiffs came in and said, we want another majority black district.
I thought they came in and said, we are not receiving equal electoral opportunity because our votes are being diluted.
Which is the same way of saying we deserve a second
No,
majority
it's
black
not,
district.
because that, again, just trust me on this.
Wait, what? No, it's not. It's not the same thing, because just trust me. Trust me on this. You know, I'll never forget when I took con law. I remember learning all about the oral arguments during Marbury versus Madison, when the Supreme Court justices used the trust me argument when making their case. God. The stupid got even better, though. Here's Ketanji Brown Jackson trying to explain why these racially gerrymandered districts have to stay. And she tries to make an argument comparing being black to being disabled and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm not joking. If this were Bull Connor back in the 60s making this argument, Or if it was David Duke taking his hood off and making the argument, well, yeah, they got to do this because being black is being disabled. There would be riots in the streets. But this woman, the woman who couldn't really define what a woman is, she tried to make the case that being black is like being disabled. It's not me saying it. Listen to her.
I guess I'm thinking of it, of the fact that remedial action, absent discriminatory intent, is really not a new idea in the civil rights laws. And my kind of paradigmatic example of this is something like the ADA. Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act against the backdrop of a world that was generally not accessible to people with disabilities. And so it was discriminatory in effect because these folks were not able to access these buildings. And it didn't matter whether the person who built the building or the person who owned the building intended for them to be exclusionary. That's irrelevant. Congress said the facilities have to be made equally open to people with disabilities if readily possible. I guess I don't understand why that's not what's happening here. The idea in Section 2 is that we are responding to current day manifestations of past and present decisions that disadvantage minorities and make it so that they don't have equal access to the voting system, right? They're disabled. In fact, we use the word disable in Milligan. We say that's a way in which you see that these processes are not equally open.
They're disabled. They're black. So they don't have access because they're disabled. I think I should just let her words resonate with you and stand there, because if I were to say that, if I were to make that case, people would rightly call me a bigot. And by the way, I would never make that case because it's moronic and borderline evil. I will give her extra points for using the word paradigmatic. Good for you. Look at you with paradigmatic. There is no truth to the Babylon Bee headline that Clarence Thomas pulled the justice aside after arguments and gently explained that not all black people are mentally disabled, just her. You do sort of conjure up the imagination of Clarence Thomas sitting on the bench a few seats away from KBJ as she's making statements like that. And he just looks at his notes and shakes his head and goes, "Ooh, child." As a way to cleanse yourself from the mental hogwash you just heard from the stupidest woman in Washington, D.C., let's take a listen to Justice Thomas succinctly sum up what this case is really all about.
What role did Robinson play in the development of SB 8?
Justice Thomas, Robinson is the only reason SB 8 exists. We fought tooth and nail in the Robinson litigation itself in telling the courts that we did not think the Constitution permitted us to draw a second majority black district. As you know, under protest, we drew SB 8 because the threat was that the federal courts were going to do it if we didn't. And that's, I think that's the best way to conceive of why SB 8 exists. We would never pass SB 8 in the first instance without Robinson, Justice Thomas.
What were the findings in Robinson?
The finding by the Middle District in Robinson was that the plaintiffs in this case were likely to show a violation of Section 2, and the likely violation, and I'm using very broad terminology because I do not know what the underlying violation is. I can't articulate that for you, Justice Thomas, because I don't think anybody can. But I think the finding in the district court's mind in that case was that the likelihood of a Section 2 violation meant that a majority black district was required, a second one. And I think that was the bottom line, and when our legislature saw that, we understood the marching order, and that's why you see SB 8 as it exists today.
Just briefly, what were the findings that led to that conclusion?
Well, Your Honor, running through the preconditions and the totality of the circumstances, I think the totality of the circumstances did most of the work for the Middle District in Robinson. Senate Factor 1, the official history of past discrimination, Justice Thomas, we can never outrun the bad era of poll taxes, of grandfather clauses, of literacy tests. I think we're always going to lose across the board on that kind of analysis, and that's what the Middle District in Robinson focused on, is how bad was Louisiana in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and, add all that together, and at the end you have a vote dilution finding that I don't think is clearly articulable in the way that SFFA requires a finding of discrimination to be specified.
That's the crux of it. And let me just cut through it if you missed any of it, because I kept referring to SB 8. That is a state Senate bill in Louisiana that was compelled by a judge that forced the additional gerrymandering of this a black congressional district. And it was based on, the arguments used was not any finding of racial discrimination today or this year or last year or in the past decade or 2 decades. They're going back to the 30s. They're going back to the 20s. So the sins of the great-great-grandfather are being visited upon people living in Louisiana today, which goes against everything that American jurisprudence would stand for. We've already had laws that were created in the 60s and 70s to right the wrongs of racial discrimination overturned by the Supreme Court, much more liberal Supreme Courts than this. That includes affirmative action admissions criteria in college applications. So if something like that were to get overturned by the Supreme Court, because we've remedied many of the racial discrimination sins of the past, certainly something as fundamental as rights and representation is on the verge of being turned over as well, if 5 of those Supreme Court justices have the courage to withstand the names they will be called, if in fact they do it. There are 3 I'm quite sure of, maybe 4. I'm not sure if the 5th one is there. We'll see. Why is this important? Well, let me show you a map here, side-by-side comparison. What you see on the left with all of those blue districts, those are the states in the South that are in question right now, the only states that have to follow these mandates because of the Jim Crow laws and segregationists past that those states sadly engaged in back when Democrats dominated. Now Republicans dominate those states consistently in the Electoral College when voting for president, in Senate races, and in congressional races, the governor's races, the state legislature races. For the most part, these states are dominated by Republicans. And just like their counterparts in the North, they would probably gerrymander their congressional districts to represent those states in the same way, like in Massachusetts, where every single district is a Democrat district. Ditto Connecticut, Vermont, Maine for the most part. But you see it in Washington and in Oregon and other states who very radically and liberally redistrict so that the political party that is in power on a dominant basis gets the maximum representation. The only reason these states in the American South have not done the exact same thing is not because Republicans are dumb. It's not because Republicans aren't cravenly political just like Democrats are and want as much power and representation as possible. No, they're the same. The only thing that's been holding these states back is this bogus Voting Rights Act, or the way it's been interpreted, I should say, because the act was fine, but the way that it's been interpreted and applied has forced these districts to be drawn along racial lines. And oh, look, it just so happens that those end up becoming Democrat districts. If the Supreme Court does the right thing, the constitutional thing, and overturns the racial criteria that's been forced on states when they draw their congressional districts, you're going to go from that map on the left to that map on the right. And it's a game changer, all right. It's a big time game changer. And this could happen before the midterms in 2028. That's critically important. What happened in Minnesota yesterday over what's going on with the ballots and voting in that state, just as important, because this could actually have ramifications across this nation if Congress steps in and does something about it. Some background: the motor voter bill in law in the 90s that Bill Clinton and the Democrats pushed through and the Republicans stupidly went along with, mandated that when you're registering to vote, or when you're registering your car or getting a driver's license at the DMV, you can also register to vote. Republicans stupidly went along with this idea that said, oh, there's too many blockades. There's too many roadblocks for people to register to vote in this country. We got to make it as simple as possible. Maybe I'm wrong. Unpopular opinion. I don't think we need to make it as simple as possible for people to vote. I think you should have some skin in the game. I think personally, you should actually need to extend yourself a little bit and show some commitment to the voting process. But that's just me talking, because I think that voting is a pretty valuable thing. That said, the argument back in the 90s was, yes, we need to make it easier for people to register to vote, not that it was hard for people to vote. So when people go and register to vote, register their cars or get a driver's license, we should also register them vote. And everyone's like, yeah, that's good. That makes sense. Of course, what's happened now is that all of those states that allow for illegal immigrants and non-citizens to obtain a driver's license, well, they are also registering people to vote. And those states also don't require voter ID in many respects. And that means that those non-citizens are voting. Duh. But in Minnesota, they went one step further. In Minnesota, they signed a law, specifically Tim Walz, the governor, signed a law passed by the left-wing legislature that not only allowed you to register to vote when you registered your car or driver's license at the DMV, no, they had automatic voter registration. Automatic. So you register your car, boom, you're registered to vote. Well, wait a minute. What if you're a non-citizen? What if you're an illegal alien? Republicans had an amendment to the law that said if you're an illegal alien or a non-citizen, the driver's license you get should have a giant banner across it that says not eligible to vote. Democrats voted it down. Democrats in Minnesota did not want any indication on a driver's license that you were not legally a voter. Why would they do that? You know why. But it gets worse. Listen to this testimony about how it's happening right now before our very eyes. There is nothing preventing non-citizens and illegal immigrants, forget about registering to vote. There's nothing stopping them from voting. Watch.
Okay, so the answer to my question is yes. Under that scenario, someone could, they get their driver's license, again, because we give them to anybody here. They register to vote. It doesn't match with the social security number, so they're flagged, but they come in as long as they have an ID, which is that driver's license, and they sign that they're, eligible to vote, they can vote. And they're then no longer flagged. They're on the system. Is that correct?
Mr. Linnell.
Madam Chair, if I could add and maybe stepping back from those that are flagged as CID on the roster, for anyone that's presenting documentation to register to vote, that is affirmation of their identity. The driver's license has not been used as proof of citizenship for the purposes of registering to vote. It's affirming that they are who they say they are. So right. In any of these cases where someone were to cast a ballot if they were ineligible to vote, there are also reports that are generated post-election for voters that are challenged that counties will run to show status of voters that had been updated due to the fact that they've now cast a ballot that can be reviewed and referred to the county attorney.
Okay, so the answer is yes to my question.
In other words, the answer is yes. Non-citizens and illegal immigrants can vote. To put a finer point on it, here's a nice side-by-side that was put together. Tim Walz signing this bill into law, driver's licenses for all, they call it.
It's done.
A packed room at the St. Paul Armory erupted after the governor's signature made driver's license for all the law of the land.
Did you hear what they were chanting? They started chanting in Spanish. They were chanting, "Yes, we did," in Spanish in Minnesota. Not Swedish, not French Canadian, not even Somalian. Spanish. And then cut to the testimony about how this law is now being applied.
So we give driver's licenses to anyone here. You don't have to be a citizen. You don't have to, which is a photo ID. So if someone comes in, they register, they have the driver's license, but they have an incorrect social or no social or whatever. So then they become incomplete. But if they walk in to vote with their driver's license, does that make them all of a sudden now okay?
Mr. Linnell.
Madam Chair, so the designation on the roster for someone whose registration had been incomplete, if they present the election judge with that acceptable identification document, that would clear the challenge from the roster and they would be permitted to cast a ballot.
Mr. Anderson.
Well, okay, there's your problem.
There's your problem. I love the understated Minnesota approach there. And of course, that's Minnesota. What about California? Well, California, this problem is happening every day on steroids.
The idea that someone would actually vote illegally with the penalties that are in place.
It happens all the time, Senator.
You
It
haven't
happens
pres-
all the
you
time.
haven't
You're just
presented-
saying it's not widespread. But I'm saying we don't know how spread it is because we don't detect it. I'm on the website for the state of California to register to vote. On the section that has where you put in your driver's license, your last four of your social, there's a box underneath each one that says, I don't have one. I don't have one. And then you're allowed to proceed to go to vote. So this idea that you're not allowed to register to vote unless you present some sort of identification is not accurate. It's not true. It's not being implemented in the state of California. Additionally, people are being registered to vote at the DMV. And we already know based on audits that the DMV has improperly registered people to vote, including illegal immigrants. And we have immunity in place that says if the DMV registers someone who is not eligible, they're immune from prosecution. So I don't believe we have sufficient safeguards in place that detect and prevent people from committing voter fraud.
Obviously, and even worse, there are no state law enforcement agencies in California who are going and investigating this voter fraud. We've just started to expand some at the federal level, but it's minuscule. And it's a very hard thing to prove. So then you've got Democrats saying, well, there's no widespread. Note the term widespread. They're conceding that it's happening, which I guess is a step forward, but they won't concede that it's widespread or affecting elections. But of course, they don't know that because it's not actually audited or investigated. Maybe it should be a priority. Listen, I know that in the political commentariat world, there's a kind of a third rail when it comes to our voting systems right now and illegal fraudulent votes that are going on, and the fact that the American people are incapable of walking away from an election, whether you're on the right or on the left, without thinking that maybe something funny happened in the last election. And I mean from the right and from the left. I've lived through the era where Democrats claimed that my president was a illegitimate president because something crazy happened during the election and that he's fraudulent and the whole thing was hacked and distorted by a foreign entity. For God's sake, Kathy Griffin, just wait till you hear everyone at the No Kings March this weekend screaming that Trump got illegally put into office by Vladimir Putin or by Elon Musk or whoever. That's bad. It's also bad when Republicans walk away from an election thinking that it was stolen by illegal ballots and illegal votes. Why are the people in charge of this country and in charge of our voting systems not more interested in ensuring that it is a solid legal process where, win or lose, everyone walks away knowing that at the very least the rules were followed? It's almost like they have a vested interest in keeping us on edge and at each other's throats and not trusting our own voting procedures in our own country. And I know that there's a lot of commentators that don't want to focus on it, that don't want to talk about it. Well, I'm sorry, between yesterday's Supreme Court arguments and between what we found out in Minnesota and what we know is going on in California, we are unafraid here. And we're going to continue to focus on this because you deserve it. Our country deserves it because the right to vote is valuable and we should treat it like the precious jewel that it is. So we'll continue to follow these stories for you, even if everyone doesn't.